This is the Power of Public Value podcast from Cardiff Business School, where we explore the positive impact of public value in everything that we do. My name is Peter Wells. I am the Pro-Dean of Public Value in Cardiff Business School. Our guest today is Professor Jane Lynch. Jane is Professor of Procurement at Cardiff Business School. She is the founder and director of the Centre of Public Value Procurement. Jane has been taking the world by storm with her irrepressible energy and a desire to make a difference in everything that she does. We do not have time to cover all her contributions. But today, in this episode, we are going to focus on one very important initiative that Jane has been instrumental in establishing, and that's the role of public value in procurement. What led you to the point where you wanted to create this Centre of Public Value Procurement?
Oh, thank you, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to have this chat this morning. It's the Centre of Public Value Procurement. I think I didn't start my journey off as an academic. I started off in industry, but most of my work in the last 15 years has been with the public sector. And I guess really observations and going to different academic conferences and meeting fellow academics and listening to the pioneering work that they're doing, and realising that the issues around procurement being a strategic lever within the organisation, whether it's private, public, third sector, are the same. We all face the same challenges, and even in the academic world, we still struggle to get procurement seen as strategic. And I guess really from my own experiences as a buyer in retail, but also observing other actions that have happened in the public and private sector, and third, where the struggles are sometimes, is that what we sometimes consider to be sustainable procurement actually doesn't necessarily deliver public value. So the idea around public value really strung a chord with me when we wrote the public value strategy in the business school, and Professor Martin Kitchener was then dean,
of course, yeah.
And I was sat on shadow management board at the time, and it was just something that struck I could easily relate to it. It was something that fitted really well into all of the things that I was doing. When we talk about supply chain management, we talk about purchasing, procurement, sourcing, however you want to talk about it. We need to do these things responsibly, and it's really thinking about, we previously tend to be quite blinkered in our approach and understanding of sustainability, in that we're addressing one of three, or in Wales, definitely four pillars. So social, economic, environmental, and in Wales, we focus a lot more on cultural and heritage side of things. But actually balancing all of those pillars when you're making decisions, and particularly when you're going out to sourcing, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's really tricky. And I think that, the questions that we now need to ask ourselves with the climate agenda is that we've really got to start thinking about, what we buy today, what impact is that going to have on tomorrow? And really, we've for too long now focused much more on the short term. And we now have to start thinking back to the long term. In many respects, I feel that what we're doing today isn't necessarily innovative. We're actually going in full cycle.
Yes, but you are very much tying it to that future generations ethos. And
I'm a strong believer in that, and that's very much so.
An important element of the Welsh kind of setting nowadays.
I think we're very, very fortunate in Wales that we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and I was very much part of the conversation in the early design of that. It was started off with the Wales We Want campaign. What would we like Wales to look like in 2050? And what do we think are the important values that will help us to achieve that? I try to embed those ways of working into what I do on a day-to-day basis. But to be honest with you, there's something that we do naturally anyway. And I think academics are natural collaborators anyway, aren't they, Peter?
Well, some of them are, Jane. Some of them are. Some of them are slightly more lonely characters. I see you brought a prop in for us. Could you explain a little bit about the
Okay.
Have a look at that.
Okay. When you asked me to bring a prop in, I sat in the garden and thought, prop. What on earth am I going to bring? Looking around the house at all the little trinkets that I've got from my various travels, things that I treasure from year upon year. But actually, I bought this really tacky thing in today.
That is truly tacky.
But what I think about this little tacky thing is quite interesting, actually.
Okay.
I think it is anyway. Okay, so yes, this is a little cheap mirror which I bought because my my now granddaughter, I've got a granddaughter and a grandson, and my granddaughter is almost 2 years old. And when she comes to see me, the first thing she does is she goes running up the stairs to my dressing table, which is mirror, and sits and looks at the mirror table, gets my brush out, starts brushing her hair, or pretending to.
Okay.
And so I thought, when it was Christmas, I thought, I'm going to buy her this little mirror. So she's got her own little mirror. And the great thing about it is that when you do this, it plays a little tune. And the first time that she looked at it, she was going, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. Peter, I'm from the generation where we didn't do selfies. We didn't take photos of ourselves. Right. Photos were probably a once in a year occasion. Today's society is obsessed with looking at themselves in the mirror and reflecting on what they think other people are thinking and how they judge them. Yes. And we've either got to reject it, or we've got to embrace it in some way. Why I think this is an important piece is because I think that to really embed sustainable public value into everything that we do, it starts with us. So a lot of what I do in terms of workshops, executive training, is about particularly around sustainability and also collaborative working. And innovation is very much about saying, well, who is your innovation champion in your organisation? Who's your sustainability champion? Who's your collaboration champion? Who knows and lives and breathes everything about that? And you can go to them and say, how do I do X, Y, and Z? What frameworks or toolkits are available for me to do that? And I think that, unfortunately, today, everybody needs to be a champion.
Right. So we all have to look in the mirror in that sense.
So we all need to now take a hard look in the mirror at ourselves. Yes. And I think very much so. So when, as I've progressed through this journey, I've started to take a long, hard look at myself. And I can tell you, I'm by no means perfect, but definitely starting to think about how I can change what I do as an individual and how the values that I preach on a day-to-day basis, am I actually living and breathing those? Yeah,
this is interesting because I think in the past, a lot of academia was about objectively and separately looking at the world. Yeah. And what you're saying is this is much more about integrating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very much so.
Public value speaks to that.
So, I had a student work, an MBA student, did a brilliant piece of work actually on transport spend in the university. That was an interesting one. Because, of course, as academics, we've been encouraged to build our international profile. And it made me think hard and fast about the way that I travel as well. And so actually I was going out to Milan to do some work, as I did quite regularly. But instead of doing the usual EasyJet flight at zero cost or very little cost, I decided to take the train. And just to see what the cost benefit was and the trade-off.
And how was that?
And it was fabulous.
Yeah, okay,
it was.
Nice.
So I think the other thing to think about that little plastic mirror is that, somebody's going to easily look at me and say, come on, you're representing public value and sustainability, and you show us this cheap bit of plastic. The point is that we've now got to start challenging where we buy things from. We've got to start being much more curious about who produce them. And that goes to something like clothing, shoes. So if we're buying a T-shirt for £3,
how is that possible?
How is that possible when it's travelled halfway across the
world?
Funnily
enough, I was saying to my own students the other day that they should go to St Fagans and go around the big house there. The big house in St Fagans in the museum. Well, if you go inside, they have some of the rooms are on display. In one of the rooms is a child's cot.
Oh yeah.
This cot was handed down from one generation to another generation, and so on, in the family, because it was a treasured item. Someone had put real love into this thing.
Third lesson from my little mirror is that what will happen when that mirror comes to the end of its life. So what I've got to teach my granddaughter to do is to look after it so that it'll still be usable in a couple of years' time. And then when she's finished playing with it, and so what I'll do to keep her interested in one thing is I'll take it away occasionally and bring it back out again.
Okay.
Today's society, we have everything readily available to us all of the time, and we expect it. So there's no excitement anymore, or very little excitement. What we've got to do is recreate that excitement and teach the younger generation to look after things that we buy. And a good illustration of that is my second prop. I know I'm not allowed to bring two props, but this was actually my son's. And my son is 31 now.
Okay.
And this is one of the Brio train sets.
Yes, Gordon,
and
I
I've
think,
kept
isn't
it. It's timeless. Percy, I think.
That is Percy, is it? Okay.
This was the first one he had.
Right.
And we've got them all.
Right.
But I know there are a few little dents in here, but actually you wouldn't know that's probably about 28 years old.
And I passed on the one from my son to my grandson.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had a whole set.
So much pleasure from doing that. They get so much pleasure. My son gets so much pleasure. I get so much pleasure. And it'll keep going for another however many, 30 years easily.
Yes, easily.
It's timeless.
Indeed.
So I guess really it's about looking after the things that we buy.
Yes.
And to be able to use them.
But how do you build that sort of interest in longevity into procurement? Because procurement is
It's tricky because
you're working in one financial year, next financial year.
And that's part of the problem. And I think that, some of the work that we've been doing through the Infuse programme, which is European Social Fund initiative, is working with the Cardiff Capital Region, working with local authorities and health boards and third sector organisations to help and encourage them. And I've been delivering procurement labs to non-procurement professionals for 3 years.
Okay.
And helping them to understand why responsible procurement is everybody's role, not just those that work in procurement. And it's interesting how just through a 4-week period of a cohort, they can see why, they start to understand the relevance and the importance of bringing procurement in at the earliest conversation. So really getting procurement understood across the organisation. So the inter-organisational boundaries are actually some of the toughest.
Right.
So that internal collaboration piece is really important.
That is interesting because I assumed in my naivety that you were mostly about linking organisations up, but you're saying
externally
that
we are,
but internally there's a piece of work.
That I always give to students is that you can't source externally until you've got your own house in order, because you're promising one thing, and it may be that you've got misaligned strategies going on in the organisation.
Right.
A good example of that when I was a buyer is that I offered we were offered an incentive discount if we paid within a certain time. And what happened? The invoice didn't get paid on that time as agreed. And when I contacted finance, they said, it's better that's not enough. We need more of an incentive. But they hadn't communicated what their strategy was so that the rest of the organisation could manage that. Yeah. And that's a really good illustration. But I actually feel now, and the question that I put out there now, the remit for procurement and the expectation of what we're going to deliver, particularly through public sector procurement, is just getting greater and greater. Is that it's seen as a strategic lever to deliver on policy and national objectives, but it can only do that if the rest of the organisation's on board. Right. So I say, is procurement now advancing at a greater pace than the rest of the organisation? So particularly, if I take finance as one good example of that, and budgets, we've been using the same budgeting silos for donkey's years. If we're going to change the way we procure, I'm not saying always, but sometimes to buy more sustainably may cost a little bit more in the short term, but in the long term, the benefits will be far greater.
Yes,
and so therefore,
persuading people.
If that's the case, and particularly if you think about if we're looking to reduce waste, for example, well, that means we're going to have to use less waste budget. So we need to be pulling money from different pots. So we need to reevaluate where the finances are being distributed.
But then that takes you into, particularly for public sector organisations, takes you into the realm of politics, because then you're looking at the short-term cycles of the political system. How do you see a route through that problem?
It's a big problem. And it's something that I was communicating with somebody from the Cabinet Office only last week, actually, and saying, we really need to do something about this. So we can, I think having worked with procurement people for a long time, I don't think I've ever been in a room with a procurement person who doesn't want to do the right thing. Sometimes they're being held back, or it may be that on their day-to-day basis, they're making the best informed decisions that are possible at that time. But then suddenly, end of year, end of financial year, suddenly they're given X amount of spend and need to spend it within 2 weeks. How can you possibly do that and embed social value at the same time in a fair way that opens competition? There needs to be a process for managing that kind of spend. And, it needs to be consistent, and it needs to consider local supply market opportunities. But a lot of that is just really down to building commercial acumen within the procurement function. And that's, some are far ahead of that curve than others, but it's definitely, and I think COVID was a really good lesson for that, is that one of the challenges with COVID is that the reality was that a lot of local authorities didn't know who their local suppliers were. or didn't know what kind of industry sectors lay within their local community because they only knew the ones that were coming forward for bids through tender process. So I think, what we really learned through the COVID pandemic period is that we need to understand our market, just like if you're in the public sector, private sector or third sector.
Course,
I mean, you wouldn't survive if you didn't know your market.
Well, indeed. And I think, I can see that your public value procurement centre is going to be doing a lot of work in this area. I wonder if you could just think a little bit about the university.
Mm-hmm.
Universities are interesting institutions. They're kind of hotbeds of innovation, and yet incredibly conservative.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that perhaps the university itself hasn't necessarily embraced a lot of these lessons, even though, of course, they are supportive of your work in a broad sense. And I just wonder, how do you see yourself kind of changing what the university itself does?
Well, I'll think about carefully what I can say in public.
Yes, of course. we can work our way. I was trying to be quite careful as well.
No, but seriously, I have actually been working with our procurement function for a number of years, sitting on a steering group with them and helping them to elevate the role of procurement that delivers on the sustainability agenda. And even though higher education, interestingly, doesn't have to necessarily to comply with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, we still act like a public sector organisation, and it's good to be seen to be leading by example. Leading by example is a term that I use commonly, almost weekly.
Well, we're very prominent, aren't we?
Exactly, absolutely. So there are a couple of things that have happened that I've tried to help and support. At the end of the day, embedding sustainability values takes time. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is really good testimony of that. So we led, so Sophie Howe was then Commissioner, led a procurement review to see how we're procuring wellbeing in Wales. And the Act came into force in 2015, and we were carrying out the research in 2018 and 19. And we had to pause a little bit because of the pandemic, but we finally published the work in 21. But what we found is that there's a willingness, but actually the rest of the organisation doesn't necessarily understand how to make that happen in practice, and doesn't necessarily give the mandate for that to happen in practice either. So that's we're talking 5 years.
Yes.
It takes a long time. We haven't got that time.
Yes.
The other reason I bought my little training is, that we all have to get on that train.
Right.
And I think the most important thing is that we start to have the right conversations, that we're using that language, and that language is in every dialogue that we have. So I think, last week I hosted an event called Optimising the Welsh Food Supply Chain.
Okay.
And I was very aware that there's a lot of really good practice that goes on, but it's very much in silos. It's isolated. One of the challenges in the supply market with supplying the public sector is scaling up. How do you scale up innovative practices to supply the public sector? And so I contacted the Welsh Government, the Foundational Economy Department, and said, look, I see these great things happening, but I don't see any scaling up going on. How about we try and join the dots up on some of these really great things that are happening? Because, in Wales, we've got this geographical displacement, as it were, or perceived, shall we say. So there's great things going on in the south, west, north. Look, why don't we all learn from each other? How can we share that? So we held a full day workshop.
Great.
We started off with a conversation starter in March, a 90-minute Chatham House rule, invited some key people in, and we had a really open and frank conversation about what we think the issues are. We categorised them. We then took that learning and we ran a full day workshop last week, which was facilitated by Sian Lloyd, actually. She did an amazing job. Yes. And it was really well attended. And I have to say how really positive and engaged everyone was. And I wanted everybody to feel involved in the discussion, because I think that, if you want to really make transformational change, you've got to allow the people who are involved to be part of that solution and to create that solution together.
And of course, what this really speaks to, almost as a kind of winding up point in a sense, but what this kind of speaks to, for me at least, is your networking.
Yeah.
To make these things happen, to make public value and procurement work, you have to have these networks being formed that cross the organizational boundaries, cross the internal ones and the external ones.
Yeah.
And you have to have some means to pull everything together.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that kind of workshop is a classic example of this.
Yeah, it is. And then, I went to another one organised by Senedd 2 days later, and then said, well, actually, if we knew these events were happening, why didn't we link them up so that everybody could benefit from all of these? So I think there's some really important lessons there. But I think going back to that food workshop and what the university role is that I approached catering and had to get Minister's sign off because Welsh Government was sponsoring the event, and we had to get Minister sign off. And these things take time, and I missed the ordering deadline.
Okay.
And initially I was confronted with, we can't do this and we can't do that. And I said, look, we're hosting a food event. We need to lead by example here. And I have to say what they delivered was well over and above and beyond.
Okay.
And they delivered some fantastic food, and everybody was commenting how relevant it was to the event that we were hosting. So
miracles happen.
So they can happen. It can happen.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. It's been short, I know, but fantastic. An insight. And I know how relentlessly busy you are. And
as are we all.
One podcast can't cover it, but
no,
who knows?
We haven't even touched the surface on it.
In this episode, we've explored how public value has been brought to bear on a crucial aspect of public, private, and indeed third sector life, and that's the procurement of goods and services. Thank you for listening. This has been the Power of Public Value podcast from Cardiff Business School.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.